Welcome to the third part of today's lecture. In this part, I'm going to talk about how groups shape the opinions of their members, because many groups that we belong to either need to take decisions or influence our own decisions in quite profound ways. And I'm going to talk about some different concepts, some of which are quite intuitive. So the first is the idea of group convergence. What they did was that they gave participants quite a difficult estimation task. They saw a dot in a dark room, a dot of light on the wall, and were asked, how far did the dot move? On the first day, participants made widely diverging estimates. And they asked them again, 4 days in a row. And not entirely surprisingly, they converged at a common response. So they developed a shared understanding of reality. Interestingly, the movement of the dot was based on an optical illusion. So the correct answer would have been 0. And all groups tend to arrive at an objectively false answer, but develop quite a lot of confidence into their shared belief. What now happens when groups start at different points? Do groups still converge? Unfortunately, they don't. That's the idea of group polarization. Within one group, we tend to develop a shared understanding. Between groups, that tends to mean that we move further apart from each other, because each group continues to hold the shared understanding. But usually, if you have some differences in the starting point, then the groups move further apart over time. So in this particular study, you had one group of somewhat more prejudiced participants, another group of somewhat less prejudiced participants. We then discussed about prejudice, and the difference became larger. Why would that be? Why would groups often end up at more extreme viewpoints than where their members were in the beginning? One explanation might just be that they expose each other to arguments in support of the, in this case, moderately prejudiced position. They hear lots of possibly persuasive arguments and then move further in that direction. There's also the aspect of social comparisons. So most of us don't want to be extreme. It's generally quite safe to have kind of a middle ground position. You want to be quite confident in something to take on a radical stance. But if I happen to be in a group where most people actually think that climate change is a really big problem, then saying we should ban cars or we should make flying really expensive suddenly isn't a very radical position anymore. So by having surrounded myself with these people, I've shifted my view of what kind of positions are acceptable. And then the third aspect is again social identity. We want to belong to a group, and quite often that means that we want everyone in the group to share beliefs, and we want those beliefs to be distinct from the beliefs of other groups. And this process of group polarization is quite important to understand and remember when we try to figure out why society is often so divided between groups that have different opinions about political and social issues. One area where we can also see such polarization is in online communication, where the idea of echo chambers has become quite popular. Because it's very easy to have online conversations, so to have exchange on Twitter, Facebook, wherever, with like-minded people. And then as we know from the basic research, true polarizations, if you have conversations with like-minded people, it tends to move everyone further away from groups that are not like-minded. In this research on online echo chambers, there's a lot of debate about how new the phenomenon actually is. Is it very different? Even without Twitter, people read their partisan newspapers and so on, and how influential is it really? Because one thing that the online world is often lacking are these strong social identities. But still, it's one area where group polarization can definitely be observed in real time. So those two aspects, group convergence onto a shared sense of reality, group polarization between groups, they both can make groups quite effective, cohesive, united. However, there are some tendencies that can make groups definitely malfunction and fail. And quite a well-known example is the space shuttle disaster in the late 1980s in the US, where they had this group of highly experienced astronauts who are supposed to be sent into space by NASA, who have the best engineers. The shuttle took off, but unfortunately, after just a couple of seconds, it blew up. Everyone on board died. Most of the nation was actually watching this on live TV. There was a lot of soul searching. What went wrong? The technical reason was quite trivial. An insulation rubber ring had broken, allowing the different gases to mix, leading to a big explosion. But why was that allowed to happen? The argument that has mostly been made in the analysis is that this is a typical example of groupthink, where decision-making is primarily shaped by the willingness to avoid disagreements. So everyone involved in the safety checks, they were all driven by the desire to get the astronauts into space, to support the mission, and to be part of this great organization. Many people knew that these particular rubber rings were a risk. They were discussed a lot. Some people knew that they were a fatal risk, but they didn't really talk about it much. It never really featured very prominently in the discussions. So when might this happen? When might we have groupthink, where reality becomes subordinate, becomes less important than emotions during the decision-making process? So in this early work by Yannis, the suggestion was that if groups are highly cohesive, if there is status associated with being a member of that group, if they don't have much exchange with others, if they are in crisis and have a strong leader, then groupthink is likely to emerge. Somewhat scarily, this seems to describe what many high-stakes situations are like. When you think about governments making decisions in crisis, military leaders making decisions in crisis, business leaders making decisions in crisis, right? So there's a real risk for groupthink to lead to very problematic decisions in important moments. Because in these situations, you might then have this idea that your group is just destined to succeed, so invulnerability. That all the group members don't want to rain on the parade. They don't want to be the naysayers, so they don't want to speak up. And then you can have this illusion of unanimity, where everyone thinks, well, everyone is in favor. Maybe personally, I'm not so sure. But I'm not yet against it, so I don't need to speak up, and all the others are clearly in favor. However, I said it's scary because it describes reality quite frequently. You can also say, as Baron did in more recent work, that this description of situations for groupthink is so right that it's wrong, that it's not actually helpful. So you have the antecedents all the time, you have some symptoms all the time, but what are the instances when this really goes wrong? It's hard to say, because it's of course also always easy to explain tragedies after the fact. So who knows if the decision-making process for the Challenger disaster would have gone differently if more people had spoken up. Maybe they would have decided in the end that it's a risk worth taking. So it's easy afterwards to say, well, this was just a dysfunctional process. But still, it's important to be aware of the risk of groupthink and to try to prevent it. How can you try to prevent it? In a very practical way, if you're making decisions in a sports team, in some other context where a group needs to come up with an action plan. One is that it's really important for a group leader to avoid setting the agenda completely. Because it's very easy to nod along in that case. So good leaders tend to speak last, at least share their opinion last rather than first. It's very helpful to get different opinions in. It's also one of the least risky ways to get contradictory opinions. No group member needs to get up and say, well, I disagree with you. Someone else can bring in the controversial opinions. It's helpful to separate idea generation and evaluation. So firstly, create a couple of different options for what you might want to do. Don't jump onto the first one and decide whether it's good or bad. Can be helpful to have a couple of subgroups that discuss separately. And finally, it's very helpful if individuals really decide what their own opinion is before they enter a group discussion. Quite often, everyone will walk out of a discussion and believe, well, I was in favor in the beginning, we now agreed on what I wanted all along. Then when you actually ask them to go back and check their notes, sometimes they realize that they actually had something completely different in mind. So if they don't even have their notes, if they don't even commit to some plan of action in advance, it's very easy for people to get swept up in the group process. But if they're aware that they've written down something, they're aware that they have a certain belief in advance, we might actually be able to use cognitive dissonance, this reluctance to let go of our beliefs. We might use that as a check on groupthink. So this was just a quick run through some of the ways in which group processes can shape our opinions and our decision making. Have a look at the reflection questions to see how that applies to your own life, and then I'll see you back for the final part of the lecture.